Proverbs chapter 5, a warning against adultery. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen well to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is as bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, and her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths are crooked, but she knows it not. Now then, my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Keep a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you give your best strength to others and your years to one who is cruel. Lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich another man's house. At the end of your life you will groan when your flesh and body are spent. And you will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or listen to my instructors. I have come to the brink of utter ruin in the midst of the whole assembly. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed, and may you rejoice in the wife of your youth, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be captivated by her love. Why be captivated, my son, by an adulteress? Why embrace the bosom of another man's wife? For a man's ways are in full view of the Lord, and he examines his paths. The evil deeds of a wicked man ensnare him. The cords of his sin hold him fast. He will die for lack of discipline, led astray by his own great folly.
After Christmas, into the new year, we're going to get into what Proverbs is probably best known for, the kind of scattergun sort of short sayings, proverbs, riddles, and we'll be covering all sorts of topics as we get into the main body of the book. This term we've been working on our way fairly slowly through these first 9 chapters, and I think what this section's been doing is laying a foundation for us. And I think what it's trying to do in part is slowly shaping our hearts and our minds to be able to suddenly recognise wisdom and recognise folly. So I think week by week, although the topics have maybe been a little bit different and we've looked at different things, we hope and pray that God through his word is giving us this a growing ability to recognise pathways. I've just recently been at a conference up in Blackpool on the beach for 3 days, and my daughter Ellie was there as well with Christ City Church Birmingham. So it's really nice to catch up with Ellie, and I got a text from her, I think the night before the conference started, to say, what year did you do the Cornhill training course? And prepare for a huge shock for those that thought I wasn't born by this year. But I did the course, I said, in 1995, 1996. That was when I did the Cornhill course. And she said, we've got somebody on our staff team who thinks he did it then as well. So he would have been there with you. So there are about 60 of us, I think, that did the course then. She told me his name. I vaguely remembered it, but wasn't really sure. And we had that weird moment, I don't know if you've ever done this, where you've maybe met somebody years after you'd last seen them, where I came face to face with Tim Hay on the first morning of the conference. And unbeknownst to me, but Eddie told me later on, that his mind was doing exactly the same as mine. As we looked at each other, and I was thinking, I'm not really sure that I recognise you. There's something vaguely familiar, but we're talking 28 years ago, and he weathered a lot worse than me, I've got to say. But it was funny, again, that we both had the same experience, and I think during the evening and back in the hotel and sort of overnight and thinking back to those days, of arriving in London for Cornhill, I then could see him. I could picture him then, this young self. He said to me he used to cycle from near Lord's cricket ground into Cornhill every day. And I remember him coming in with various bike clips, but just that young face, I suddenly saw him. And it just sort of weirdly illustrated for me what I think some of what's happening in Proverbs. We won't remember all of the details, will we, of course, of the 4 chapters that we've been through so far. But what we are hoping is that God, as he works through his word and through his spirit, is actually beginning to sort of attune our hearts and minds to know what wisdom looks like and to begin to identify folly. And we'll, as I say, we'll see that very practically in the new year as we look at different topics and things. But that's some of what's been going on. And it's interesting, actually, again, from what John's just read to us, it's interesting in a foundational sort of 9 chapters, how much space is now going to be given to the subject of adultery. I find that quite surprising, really, in a kind of an introduction, a foundation to the book. That if you look down, if you've got headings in your Bible, you'll see warning against adultery at the top of chapter 5. Next week, first half of chapter 6, we're going to take a break and look at 3 other areas that folly would lead us into. But then halfway through chapter 6, another warning against adultery. And then chapter 7, another chapter on this subject. And that sort of means for this morning, I do want to just make a couple of introductory comments on this and just give a few extra minutes to sort of leading us into thinking about it. It's clearly an important subject. I mean, that's sort of fairly obvious, isn't it? That even in 9 chapters, if you give almost 3 directly to this kind of subject, it clearly God is saying something and wants to say something to us on this subject. Another thing, there's about 4 of them, so buckle in. Another thing to say, of course, is that Proverbs was written to God's people at a time where they'd already received certainly the first 5 books of the Bible. So in terms of God's wisdom, we talked, I think, in chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, how God, by wisdom, created everything. It's important, I think, for us to remember that wisdom has been woven in by God into the fabric of his creation, the order of creation, and everything he's done. So we take the wisdom that's gone before, the fact that God has made us male and female, the fact that God has deliberately made us biologically different and complementary, the fact that God has woven into the first few chapters of Genesis the sort of plan, the wisdom that a man will leave his family and a woman will leave her family, and the two, having sort of left there, cleave together or united together, they become one flesh, is the phrase that's used there in Genesis. A new sort of entity together, a place again in God's wisdom where children can be born and society can be built around. Now, it's also important for us to say, as you take on board everything the Bible says, that God has calls us to different things. He calls some people to an unmarried life. He calls other people to a married life. One is not better than the other. Our identity is not to be found in marriage or finding somebody or being unmarried. The two are different. Paul refers to them both as gifts. Paul, if you read 1 Corinthians 7, it's quite funny because he's not married himself, and he says, I wish you were all like me. He's so single-minded, for the gospel, that Paul would just love to have more and more people like him that have a different way of life to those that are married and so on. So it's, again, important as we come into this subject that we're not coming in saying there's only one way or there's a better way or anything like that. God's wisdom works out differently with different people and the things that he calls us to. The other thing to say about marriage that you do see in the Old Testament, and then again it ramped up in the New Testament, is that it's a picture. God refers to himself as a husband to the people of Israel in the Old Testament. He views his relationship with them as a marriage covenant. So whenever we begin to think about human marriage or adultery, as in these chapters, we've always got in the back of our mind that God is a husband to Israel. God will not forsake Israel. God will keep his promises to Israel. All of that sits in the background in the Old Testament. And then, of course, in the New Testament, Paul takes that idea in Ephesians and says marriage also is a picture of Christ and his church, Christ and his bride. And although he says it's mysterious, God in Genesis 1 and 2 wove marriage for some into the fabric of creation, knowing that it would be a picture of these greater realities. The people receiving the book of Proverbs first off would know in the law that God has said in the Ten Commandments that adultery is wrong. It was short and sweet, the commandment, but absolutely clear that is wrong. In fact, the Bible says any sex outside of that marriage is wrong. It's not God's wisdom. Jesus, of course, raised the stakes even further by saying that you can commit adultery without any physical interaction with any other person. So Jesus says the root of adultery is in the human heart. We look with our eyes, we lust with our eyes, we go into some sort of heart and mind thing through what we see, and we effectively commit adultery in our hearts. So we need, as we come to these chapters, to be bearing in mind God's wisdom, his design, and everything that the Bible says. The third thing we need to bear in mind when we come to this is that this, for most, if not everybody in this room, in some way, shape or form, is a difficult issue. There'll be all sorts of feelings whenever we come to this topic. There'll be all sorts of stuff we're aware of ourselves. There'll be feelings of guilt. There'll be feelings of shame. There'll be feelings perhaps of failure. There may be anger towards others, towards God. There may be hurt. There may be a weariness of ongoing temptations. There could be 101 things, as in there might be more than one for people here. This is a big, big thing. And it actually means, believe it or not, that coming to talk this morning on this and again in 2 weeks' time is really difficult. Because if you were sat down with one person and you could talk and lay your hearts on the table, you would sort of know something of how this is for the other person, for each other. Really difficult to stand here not really knowing a lot of the stories and the hurts, the wounds, the pain, the difficulties, the mistakes that are out there. So it's really difficult from that point of view. It's also difficult because, and I'm sure this has always been the case, but it seems so ramped up now, doesn't it, that the world we are living in, the times that we're living in, it just seems like a tidal wave of stuff in terms of sex in one way or another that we're just confronted with. And I think, and again, this is always the case, but it's just so clear now, we are living in a society in this country that has embraced folly almost in its totality. And that's the world we're in. The songs that we've sung just on this in terms of us personally have been great this morning. The hope that we have is something that we need to see so clearly on this topic. Jesus on the cross in your place took every single shred of sexual sin that you have ever known in your life, and he willingly gathered it all up in its entirety, everything that has been part of your life or mine, and willingly took that as our shepherd to the cross. He nailed our sin, our sexual sin and imperfections and impurities and mistakes and everything. He took every last shred of that to the cross to deal with it. And this is the wonderful thing, isn't it, about the gospel, that you are totally forgiven if you have put your trust in Jesus Christ. He has redeemed you. He has transferred you and me from the dominion of darkness into the kingdom of his Son that he loves. He's made you his son. He's made you his daughter. You are washed way more than you realise and that I realise. We have been declared righteous in the sight of a holy God, amazingly through what Jesus has done. We're free now to begin to live a different life. He's put his Spirit in us to help us, to empower us, to heal us, to restore us. So we come at this chapter from the context of a wonderful position of hope and acceptance with God. The last thing to say, and then we will just dip in, is do please remember the context here. We've mentioned this before. Let me say it again. This is a father speaking to his son about the sort of things that his son may face, or the temptations his son may face. So over these chapters, you will read a lot of references to your neighbour's wife, or to a forbidden woman, or to an adulteress, or to a prostitute. None of this is intended to say, look at all those evil women that are bringing problems. It's purely because a father is speaking to his son about the things that he thinks his son is going to face. And so these are the words of a loving father wanting to equip his son. We need to bear that in mind. I I can't see any reason why all of these things are not just reversible and interchangeable, men for women, women for men. So please do hold on to that. I don't think the writer's trying to be sexist or anything here. It's just the context of, it's like me sitting down with Henry, talking about what, may be ahead for Henry and trying to help him. So it's a loving father speaking to his son about things that really matter. And I think as we go into this, and as I say, there'll be a break because of 3 other topics that folly we'll look at next week, and then we'll return to it the following week. But for this week, if you want just 2 headings to hold on to, if I can summarise the chapter down, as John did with his memory verse, just down to those key things, essentially he's going to say 2 things. Firstly, avoid the path that leads to deep regret. And then secondly, drink deeply of your own cistern or fountain. So that's where, the way he's going to go. Let me try and go reasonably quick. We'll have an opportunity in groups in the week to pick away at this and unpack and talk together and try and help each other. I'll probably forget to say this at the end, so let me say it now. I think as Christians, we often don't talk about these things, in my experience. I don't know, your experience may be different. It's such a big issue. For us to be kind of silent with each other on is probably not helpful. We need to find help from God and from one another. So try to make the most of growth groups and find a Christian you can chat to. Right, let's quickly jump in. Verses 1 and 2 will seem familiar. My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. So God and the Father in this passage wants his son to listen. We've heard this so many times. Pay attention, turn your ear to wisdom and insight. And that the hope is that wisdom will go in and will essentially come out on his lips. Knowledge will be preserved. He will know these things, hold on to them, live by them, speak them. And he very skillfully then goes from the lips of his son to another pair of lips in verse 3. For the lips, he says, of the adulterous woman drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil. And it's an interesting thing, isn't it, here? I don't know if you like honey. I'm not really a honey fan, so it doesn't help. But I think the image starts physical, doesn't it, of these lips dripping with this sweet substance, honey. The sort of visual, in a sense, draws you in. The image is deliberately enticing. The lips of the adulterous woman or man drip honey. There's something appealing. There's something that would draw you in. But actually, the focus in verses sort of 2, 3, 4 is not so much on the physical lips. It's on her words. The lips of the adulterous woman drip honey. Her speech is smoother than oil. So there's something about the words, something about the interaction, something that's said by the other person, what it speaks of that is enticing, that then connects with our sinful nature, the desires within. The physical look, the words that come that entice and that would lead a person into a particular direction. As we said before a couple of weeks ago, folly will always appear attractive, certainly in the beginning. I've drawn a little diagram on my page here. I've got a little signpost. I've never been very good at drawing, but I've got a little signpost here with the word folly on, perhaps with some leaves obscuring it so you can't really quite see that that's what the sign says. But what you can see is the beginning of the pathway. So we talked a couple of weeks ago, perhaps the early slabs of diamonds or a beautifully crocheted blanket, whatever it is that you find alluring or attractive. That's how the road to folly begins. But then on my diagram on the page, the road goes up there and then round the corner, and you can't actually see where it goes. And that absolutely is an image, I think, that sums up this first half of this chapter. The lips are a drip of sweet honey. The talk is smooth as oil. It's enticing, but, verse 4, in the end, she is bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. I had to look up gall. You can guess it's a plant that has a particularly bitter taste, apparently. So the initial context is one of sweet honey that then turns bitter. In fact, it brings injury. It's as sharp as a double-edged sword. It will do damage. Verse 5, her feet, in fact, go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly. but she does not know it. I went to, it's only happened once in my life. I don't know how you got on going to other people's houses for meals and things. We were invited kindly somewhere last night, and the food was just amazing. It was wonderful. I've only ever once been somewhere where I could not eat. It was awful. I could not eat what we were given. I was dying. It was just wanted the world to swallow me up. I don't know what else was in it, but it had prunes in it. So if you ever invite us, please don't go down there just for a laugh. But I bit into this thing. Should be on a banned list of substances, I think. But yeah, I bit into it. It was so awful. I literally thought I was going to be sick. I was doing what my sister used to do when we were little, hiding her sprouts under things, hoping my parents wouldn't spot them, you know. But that sort of taste is the image here is of that sort of honey and the sweet sort of allure and smooth words and being drawn into something that then just turns awful in the mouth. And from these verses on, the Father, you can see the Father and the heart of the Father saying to the Son in verse 6 that this person, in this case, verse 6, is this woman that he's imagining, this sort of encounter. She's somebody who has no thought for the way of life. She's just somebody for whom wisdom and God and where life can be found is just not in her mind. Her paths are wandering aimlessly. She doesn't really know what she's doing or where she's going. But the Father's saying that in being enticed into this, you're locking arms with her, and she, round this corner of folly, is heading to the grave. And the honey lips could take you with her. And so his advice is really not complex. Have a look at verse 8. Verse 7, my son, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say. Verse 8, keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. It's so simplistic, isn't it? Keep to a path that is nowhere near the path that she's on. Do not go near the door of her house. Paul in 1 Corinthians, when he's speaking not just about adultery but all sexual immorality, just says, and perhaps this proverb was in his mind, flee, run. Joseph literally ran at the end of Genesis with Potiphar's wife as she was sort of making advances. He literally ran, which is what verse 8 is saying. And it's like, I don't know if they're still about in the village. I remember when we were younger, there would often be like an electricity, I don't know what they are, they're generators. What is the thing that's fenced off? But you get them now and then, don't you, in different places. And particularly nowadays, you probably get yellow and black signs all over it that say danger, danger. And then you've got that wonderful picture. Did you see it? Have you seen it? Of the person sort of like this, with a big lightning bolt coming down. You know, danger, don't enter. That's verse 8. Don't go anywhere near, son. Somebody once said, and in some of my reading on this, the threshold once crossed is very difficult to leave. The threshold once crossed is very difficult to leave. And we need to stop personally at the minute and think, is there a live issue at the moment? It may be to do with adultery, but it will be either in the heart or physically. Do we need to run? Are there things, people, situations, circumstances that we literally need to run from with God's help, depending on him, praying, but we need ultimately to run? The next few verses sort of again unpack why. Just keep your eyes down at verse 9. Lest you lose your honour to others and your dignity to one who is cruel, lest strangers feast on your wealth and your toil enrich the house of another. We had this experience in our extended family of a dad getting into an adulterous relationship with somebody else. And the words here, just his honour, his dignity, his respect from his wife, his children, from family, friends, just It was devastating. Verse 10 hints at the sort of broken family, the diversion of wealth in this situation then that essentially goes to strangers, and the impact of these things. And of course, this doesn't say anything about the impact on children, family, society, friends, anything, but we know it. And verse 11 and to 14, and again, it seems to be speaking to it will be speaking to a member of God's people, the people of Israel. Verse 11, at the end of your life you will groan. When your flesh and body are spent, you will say, as you look back, how I hated discipline and how my heart spurned correction. I would not obey my teachers or turn my ear to my instructors, and I was soon in serious trouble in the assembly of God's people. I don't think it's the case, is it, that any of us draw towards the end of our life and sort of think, that I'd been more unfaithful. Oh, that I'd enjoyed more affairs or committed more adultery. No, the reality is one of regret. And that's the end of the pathway of folly. This is the Father with the Son lovingly urging him not to go down the path that leads to regret. There's a complete change of gear then in verse 15 as we go into the second half of this chapter. And we'll be brief on this, but he says there's a change in imagery here. So we have the images of counterfeit honey or gall or double-edged swords or death. These are replaced now in these verses by pictures of running water, of overflowing springs, of streams of water and fountains, images of life and refreshment and purity. The experiences in the first half of loss and cost and regret are replaced by images of blessing and rejoicing and satisfaction and intoxication. I can't remember what word you had, John, in your translation. It was slightly different, wasn't it? But the sort of intoxication is the image. In this verse now the Father says to the Son, and we don't really know at this stage if the Son is married or not, but he's saying if you do go down that route of marriage, love your wife. Love your husband. Love one another faithfully, forsaking all others for life. But actually, if you look closely, keep your eyes down at the verses, these verses are saying more than that. Proverbs 5 isn't just saying don't have sex outside of your marriage, it's saying enjoy sex in your marriage. Verse 15, have a look down. Drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. And then don't do this, verse 16. Should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public square? No, let them be yours alone, never to be shared with strangers. May your fountain be blessed. May you rejoice in the wife of your youth. And then another image, a loving doe, a graceful deer. May her breast satisfy you always. May you ever be intoxicated with her love. Why, my son, be intoxicated by another man's wife? Why embrace the bosom of a wayward woman? Seems like a really weird example, this, but again, I heard somebody using it, and I thought, yeah, I can see what they're saying. They were talking about milk. What does milk say on it if you're going to enjoy your milk? Can you give me the words that are on any carton of milk? Drink cold, keep refrigerated. So I heard this person speaking about this, saying, somebody looking at this sort of 4-pinter of milk, thinking, I don't want to be bound by these kind of rules and regulations. I want to be free with my milk. And so they pop it on the mantelpiece above the open fire so they can gaze on their milk and enjoy the look of their milk and whatever. And then 3, 4, 5, 6 days later, have you ever seen this? Hopefully you haven't. It's horrible. They go out to pour the milk on the crunchy nut cornflakes and it falls as blobs and chunks and gunk and it smells. Part of Proverbs 5 is actually saying that is where folly will lead you. Wisdom says, don't do that. Don't go there. Don't say, I know better than God, who has built his wisdom into creation. But Proverbs 5 isn't only saying don't do that with sex or don't do that with your milk. Proverbs 5, in these verses 15 to 20, is saying enjoy your refrigerated milk. Sex is a good gift that God has given in marriage. It's something, and the language here is so telling, isn't it? To be rejoiced in with your husband, with your wife. It uses the language of satisfaction, of intoxication. That the sort of charge levelled at the church, that the church is anti-sex, is completely wrong. Proverbs 5, Song of Songs, is full of the love, isn't it, of a husband and a wife, and a much sort of physical talk in that. So if we are married here this morning, Proverbs 5 encourages us to seek to prioritise our relationship, to enjoy physical intimacy together. It's an important sort of part of that one flesh union that God has blessed marriages with and has put within there. But I think just as we said at the beginning, we also need to be real in the fact that because this issue is difficult for many, with perhaps all sorts of things in our background, our history, our experiences, it means that as a married couple, there needs to be incredible love shown and a place of support and care and trust and intimacy of that nature as well as physical intimacy. But let's not just hear the one part of this chapter and not the other part. Avoid the path that leads to regret, but drink deeply at your own cistern. And I think just for any in the room for whom this, perhaps due to age or any other things, as you're sort of thinking, well, I don't really know where marriage sits for me at the moment, with the age that I am or what I'm doing. I think that it's good, isn't it, to look at the wisdom of this chapter in terms of guiding our thinking, our future, our interactions with people. Recognise folly and recognise wisdom. And not only, here's just a finish, is this a father, perhaps Solomon, sitting with his arm around his son, looking down the future and the potential of different pathways. This is ultimately our Father, isn't it, speaking to us in these chapters with his arm around us, having given complete and utter forgiveness and acceptance and cleansing and everything, saying, listen to wisdom, walk in the ways of wisdom, and beware of folly. Let's just have a minute of quiet, maybe just to speak ourselves to God. And maybe just quietly to pray for those around us as well.